Welcome back to Your Pennsylvania Ancestors Part 2 of Irish American Research. I'm going to keep this introduction short. If you haven't listened to Part 1 with Ulster Historical Foundation, check that out. It's just the previous episode, episode 30. In this episode, we're just going to keep plowing on with our top 5 misconceptions and errors that people make in that Irish research. And don't forget, these folks with the Ulster Historical Foundation, their expertise you can get in an online class through them. Check out their website, links in the show notes. This is Denise Allen with PAAncestors.com, and I'm going to hand it over to William, Gillian, and Fintan right now. Let's go. So we touched on this a little bit, but number 4 is that you can always be sure of the origins of the family because of the surname. And you specifically mentioned the MC versus the MAC, Mac and Mick. So what do we do over here with that?
There are surnames that are maybe mainly associated with one particular region, but still you can't rule out the possibility that it may have a different origin. You take a name like Smith, which is the most popular name in England. It's either one or the most popular names in Scotland as well, and is a very popular name in Ireland. Well, it could well be that people named Smith living in Ireland have an English or a Scottish background, but it could be that the Smiths living in Ireland are of Gaelic Irish background because, for instance, the name McGowan, which is particularly associated with County Cavan, McGowan means son or descendant of the Smith. And so in the Anglicization of names, which is very commonplace, McGowan became Smith. So keep in mind that you cannot be absolutely certain in every case about the origin of a name. A name like Cunningham sounds very obviously Scottish, but Cunningham could also be a derivation from an Irish name as well. So you can't assume that if you have Cunningham ancestors, they must be Scottish. The change of names over time, the Anglicization of names, and bearing in mind that if you do find your ancestor's name in a document, more than likely, they did not write that name down themselves. Somebody else was writing down that name, whether it was a minister or a clerk or some other government official, and they were writing down what they heard, or they were writing and spelling it in the way they were used to spelling it. So never get too hung up about the spelling of a particular name. Never think that, no, they couldn't be my ancestors because we always spelled our name with an E, for example, something like that. Keep as open a mind as possible on the spelling of names. And some names can have significant changes in the name, or maybe even very subtle changes in the name as well. You take a name like Pollock, Pollock, and Pollock is a name from my part of the world, or found in my part of the world in North County Tyrone. And the name, if you go back into earlier records, you very often find the name Pollock written as Polk, P-O-L-K, as in your own President Polk, or Pogue, P-O-G-E, or P-O-A-K, or P-O-G-U-E, but they're referring to the same name, Polk, or Pollock rather. So names can have subtle or maybe quite significant variations in spelling. A name like Dunlop or Dunlap, some earlier records for that are Delap, D-E-L-A-P. Sometimes you'll find a name that in one record is spelled Johnson, and in another is spelled McShane. Well, McShane is simply, Johnson is simply son of John, and McShane is the Irish for son of John. So
that's quite a difference, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes,
that would throw me off the path for sure.
It's like McGowan to Smith, for example. Yes. So keep an open mind on spellings and never think that, no, my ancestors only ever spelled their name in this way. And so any variant at all means, well, they couldn't be my ancestors.
Mm.
Don't fall into that trap.
We couldn't reinforce that point enough, Denise. about the variant spelling. But if you go back to the records, especially to the 18th and then the 17th century, there's absolutely no standardization of spelling. And in the 17th century, you've got the English administrators dealing with a lot of very Gaelic Irish names, and maybe they're double, triple barreled Irish names as well. But the other thing to remember is Scots Gaelic names as well. And that's on the issue of the Mac and Mick. That's where I suppose to start the conversation on that. But just reinforce the point William made about variations. My name is Mullan, and in the Irish it would be Mullan. So it's descendant or grandson of, and this in this case would be off the bald. So Muil is to be tonsured like a monk, so to have the top of your head shaved, as opposed if your hair falling out. So I am Mullan, but in the Irish or in the English it's Mullan. But in the modern spelling we would spell our name A-N. But almost everywhere where I look for my Mullan ancestors who come from Tyrone in the 19th century, the spelling is nearly always I-N or E-N, and almost never is it A-N. The other thing, a point to bear in mind, is the origins of a surname. And you take a name like McCarthy. Well, McCarthy might come from Cork or Kerry, but it doesn't mean your McCarthy's come from Cork or Kerry. So although the counter to that, Mullan is generally found in Derry and Tyrone, and my Mullins come from Tyrone, even though I live in County Down now. So that, and in that instance, can be a very useful clue. But in terms of Mac and Mick, the simple issue, and again, this is one of those ones that just won't seem to go away, is a common mistake that Mac is Scottish and Mick is Irish. They're actually the same thing, and Mick is just a contraction of Mac. And then you look at the records of the 17th, 18th century, you'll see, and then 19th century, M-A-C, M-C, M apostrophe, and it also leads to other like Ma, so you get Magorian or McGrath, so you get Mag coming into that as well. The key thing to remember, Mac and O are prefixes to Gaelic names, and these are Gaelic Scottish names and Gaelic Irish names. The Gaelic language, i.e. Irish and Scots Gaelic, are linked. And Scots Gaelic is said to be a derivation of Irish. And up until about 400 years ago, they were recognized almost as the same thing, but they started to diverge and spelling differed. And so, for example, in the Gaelic Irish, you will only ever see an accent that is like a French acute accent going up away from the end. Whereas in Scots Gaelic, you will see spellings what use the equivalent of what you would say as a French grave accent, and it's going the other direction. So they started to grow apart, if you will, in terms of spelling and pronunciation, meaning of words several hundred years ago. But it's true to say that Gaelic Irish speakers and Scots Gaelic speakers could converse with one another in the same way that an Italian and a Spaniard could converse with one another, even though they don't speak the same language. There's enough commonality. So there's not different names. There's Scots Gaelic names and there are Irish Gaelic names, and they all start with Mac or O. So the MC is simply a contraction of MAC or M apostrophe and so on. And don't forget as well, these prefixes mean something. They mean son of in the case of Mac, or O will be descendant of or grandson of. But don't forget, because we come from Gaelic names, going back in time or even now, there will be different prefixes for females. So I am Fintan Mullan, but my daughter is Aving Nick Mullan. So a female might take NIC or NI Fada as a prefix to their name. So again, reinforcing that point that these are Gaelic names that have been anglicized. And because there's massive variety in the spelling of these names and the origins of these names, describing, if you take William's example, very useful example of McGowan and Smith. So a lot of the names derive from trades, just as you have anywhere around the world, Cooper, Thatcher, and so on. Ditto, you'll have Gaelic names derive in that way. Don't forget also, as we go through several hundred years, names could have been Gaelic and then have been anglicized and then have been Gaelicized again. And of course, in the flowering of the Gaelic revival in the end of the 19th century, Yeats and Synge and the Abbey Theatre, etc. There's great pride in the Gaelic language, the founding of the Gaelic League. And where before there had been a policy of several hundred years of the British authorities forcing anglicization of Gaelic names onto the Irish population, who, remember, up until the time of the Great Famine, the majority of the people on the island of Ireland did still speak the Gaelic language. And that's true in the north as well, places like North County Antrim, where they spoke Irish, but it was very much more like Scots Gaelic than it was Gaelic of the southern provinces. So again, reinforces the connection between the languages. But in the Gaelic revival, you have this great trend back to people Gaelicizing their name again because it was fashionable. And Cormac O'Grada a very highly respected historian, in a lecture talked about polite Edwardian society in Dublin would ask one another, have you taken the O yet? Have you anglicized or Gaelicized your name back again to be fashionable? So simple thing is Mac and Mick are the same thing, and Mac is not Scottish and Mick is not Irish. They're Gaelic names, and as William Gain made that point right at the start, they're Gaelic names that can be found on the island of Ireland or in Scotland. And Kennedy is a good example of that. You'll find in the Gaelic it'll be O'Cinada, and in the south you can find it. For example, President Kennedy's family come from the southwest corner. You can find Kennedys in the northern counties, and of course you find Kennedy as a Scottish name as well. So it's a fabulously rich subject, and that's the complexity we see in the records, is this constant getting the grips of how you spell Gaelic names, but using an English alphabet. So you get church ministers, priests, or you've got clerks of court or clerks or an estate office official trying to render a Gaelic name as they heard it. And the same thing happening when our ancestors got to the other side of the ocean and someone in America or Canada tries to write down their name as they pronounce it, which is why we have such vast variation of them. So wonderfully interesting subject, and some great resources to explore it further. The best one would be Edward MacLyssett's Surnames of Ireland, which has been around since the late 1950s, and it's still the acknowledged work on the subject. And there's another great book we're actually just about to bring out a new edition of, is the Book of Ulster Surnames by Robert Bell. And Bell demonstrates the complexity and the interconnectedness between these people in Ulster and Scotland in particular, but also England, Wales, France, and other places further afield. But just to finish, I just want to just quote MacLysett. This is from MacLyssett's Surnames of Ireland on that thorny issue of Mac and Mick. And he goes on, I need hardly refute again the once prevalent idea that the Mac is a sign of Scottish origin, since everyone must now be familiar with such essentially Irish names as MacMahon, MacGuire, McNamara, McCarthy. And here let me also refer to the fallacy that MC is Irish and MAC Scottish. And then he says in brackets, rather cheekily, or was it vice versa? So he's just poking a little fun at the absurdity of this.
That's funny.
Yeah, I mean, it can be quite complex, but I wouldn't equally be too overwhelmed. I certainly would read either of those surname books to get a better sense of the different variations that you might find of your surname, and it gives you some idea, you know, if there's particular parts of Ireland or Scotland those surnames would be found in. But a lot of the particularly more recent websites and databases, you know, will pick up a lot of those surname variant spellings anyway. But it's always best just to keep an eye on that, because some of those websites do those variant spelling searches better than others. So sometimes you might manually need to put in a few different spellings. So again, that's something just to be mindful of. Be very broad-minded, as William said, about how your ancestor's surname may have been spelt by a clergyman or a clerk, but also just in terms of your searching of those online sources, just make sure that it is capturing all the different ones. I would actually just keep a list of all the different spellings, both of the place name, because the spelling of that, as Fintan said, can vary as well, but also of the surname. Just keep a list in your notebook so that every time you're searching a new database, you're making sure that it is capturing all of those different variant spellings.
Oh, that's great advice. And for people to know too, when they're researching in Pennsylvania records and some of our more rural counties where the Irish came early, if they're looking in the original clerk's ledger book where it hasn't been computer indexed, the MCs and MACs actually had their own tabs. So if you check M and you don't see them, just keep going, because they gave them their own section.
Just to give you an example, that book we're just about to republish, it's the Bell's Surnames of Ulster. There's about 500 surnames in the principal list that he describes in some detail. But in his index, he lists nearly 3,000 names that he cross-references to those 500 names. So again, gives an, but also, as Gillian said, don't be bamboozled by the complexity. It's just something to dive into and enjoy. It's the richness of Irish history and our culture through our languages on the island of Ireland and in Scotland. But there are wonderful resources to help you navigate your way through it.
So number 5 is, and we did touch on this one a little bit, but the misconception that people never change their religious affiliation. So Pennsylvania had 28, 30 distinct religions by 1800. We were a very free state, so chances are when people came here, they could have converted to almost anything. But, as we're doing our Irish research, how often did people change their religion?
Well, again, we would emphasize very much to, keep as open a mind as possible on the religious affiliation of your ancestors. I mean, let me just, from my own family history, give a few examples. My father was baptized in Brady Reformed Presbyterian Church. My grandfather Roulston was baptized in Maharamason Presbyterian Church. And my great-grandfather was baptized in Donalong Church of Ireland, so the Episcopal Church. So there's 3 generations of the family, 3 different religious denominations, 3 different religious buildings. And it wasn't because the family was moving around. This is while the family was living on the same farm throughout that period. And each of these churches is within 2 miles of the family farm. So, people did change religion. So don't think that your ancestors were, for example, my ancestors were only ever Presbyterians. Well, they may not have been, they may have been, but the chances are they weren't necessarily. Gillian has highlighted the example already of the lady in Australia whose ancestors were not what she imagined in terms of the religious affiliation. So people did change, and for a whole variety of different reasons. Very often was on marriage, for instance. So whenever a couple married, they maybe went to the church of one or other of them, which may not have been the church to which the both parties had been members. There was maybe a dispute with the minister. Maybe there was a disagreement or a falling out with somebody else in the congregation. So for many different reasons, and for reasons that we are for most part lost to us now, of course, we can't really understand in every case, why did my ancestor change from this church to this church? In another instance in my family history, going back to the 19th century in Donegal, my great-great-great-grandfather baptized 8 of his children in one particular church, but the youngest was baptized in a different church because in the intervening period he'd fallen out with some of the people in that church, and so had changed to another church. So keep in mind, or rather keep as open a mind as possible on the religious affiliation of your ancestors. If you've identified where they're living and you've identified the churches in the vicinity of where they lived, check all of those records. Don't say, right, I'm not going to check the Catholic records because they were definitely Protestants, or don't say, I'm not going to check the Episcopal records because they were definitely Presbyterians. Check all the records. And people didn't necessarily attend the church nearest to where they lived. People maybe traveled several miles further away from where they lived to attend the church they wanted to attend, and maybe walked past one or more churches to get to that church. So again, keep that in mind as well.
Mm-hmm. There's also, if we look at our history from the 18th century and the penal legislation, so the penal laws are passed against the Catholics and Presbyterians, impacting how they practice their faith, go about worship, and also live their daily lives. And the worst of the penal laws were not attacking people's professing and living their faith. It impacted them economically in the holding of land, the transfer of land, career advancement in society. For Catholics, couldn't hold a commission in the military, or couldn't be an MP, couldn't be a judge, in the judiciary. Presbyterians suffering a lot of similar sort of strictures, and so these penal laws, that was the one side, that sort of the stick. The carrot was, if you converted, then you would be entered into the full communion of the Church of Ireland, the Episcopal state church to which you were to belong. So often Catholics and Presbyterians, simply to protect family interests in terms of the right to transfer the property, to leave the family farm to the eldest son, etc., they just made an outward show of conforming to the Episcopal faith. So you can find Catholics and Presbyterians showing up in Episcopal records, Church of Ireland records in the 18th century. And it's not a deep-seated conversion of faith going on there. It's simply real politics. They're just looking to protect their financial well-being and that of their families. So there's all sorts of little sleight of hands might have been done just simply to please the authorities, to let people go about their daily lives. And you see evidence, for example, even earlier We talked about right at the start the loss of records and the loss of the Church of Ireland records, and we said about look for other sources. Well, one of those in the case of Church of Ireland parish registers was the Parish Register Society of Dublin, 20 years before the Four Court Fire started publishing old Church of Ireland parish registers from the 17th and 18th century. And in one case, the registers of the Liberties of Cashel, the registers were burned, but the Parish Register Society had published those before the Four Courts Fire, so they survive in copy form. What's interesting about those records, that's an Episcopal church, but very many of the people conducting marriages and baptisms in that church are from a Catholic background in that part of County Tipperary. So there may be any, as William says, there could be all sorts of reasons of personalities falling out or out for show of pretense. So one is never quite sure why one would find an ancestor. Don't forget also adult converts to, so for example, Protestants converting to the Catholic faith that you may find and be quite surprised to find. So as William, and I suppose we say it about almost everything, but keeping an open mind is absolutely critical.
And the other thing just to bear in mind as well is that traditionally in Ireland, the couple marry in the wife's church. So even if, the husband and then later on the rest of the family are Presbyterian or whatever, you may actually find that marriage takes place in the Church of Ireland or a different denomination. So again, that's why you need to be quite broad-minded, because the wife may have belonged to a different denomination and then became the same denomination as her husband after marriage. And the other thing is, William mentioned, searching all the different kinds of church records for the area. There are some records, particularly burial records and vestry minute books within the Church of Ireland that actually very often included records of everyone who lived in the parish, not necessarily just Church of Ireland. People attended that church, anyone Presbyterian, Roman Catholic, Methodist. So it's well worth, as William said, just being very broad-minded and checking all those church records, because you may find a record of your ancestor just somewhere where you just don't expect.
Oh.
And in the case of graveyards, remember also for a period of something like 200 years, everybody was buried together in the same graveyard in many instances. So they're buried in the old parish churchyard, which pre-Reformation was, Christian church. After the Reformation, now usually in the hands of the Church of Ireland, the Episcopal Church, but Catholics, Episcopalians and Presbyterians very much are burying in the same places all the way through the 18th century and into the 19th century, until the Catholic Church and the Presbyterian Church begin to develop their own separate burial grounds, or you have, the coming along of the large municipal, city cemeteries that developed in the second half of the 19th century. So you may find a Catholic or Presbyterian ancestor buried in a Church of Ireland graveyard.
The history of our religious denominations. I mean, to take Methodism as an example, many people who have Methodist ancestors in America, their ancestors were maybe Presbyterians or another religious denomination in Ireland. But certainly John Wesley made many visits to Ireland during the course of his ministry. He first visited Ireland, I think, in 1747, and he attracted a large following. And many people attended Methodist meetings. But it wasn't until the early 19th century that a branch of Methodism began to conduct its own marriage ceremonies and baptisms and keep records of those. So if you're looking for baptisms and marriages of people who sympathized with or supported Methodism prior to the mid-1810s, then you need to look at the records of other religious denominations, such as, for example, the Church of Ireland. So a sort of a broad understanding of the history of religious denominations in Ireland would be useful as well for those pursuing their family history.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think a lot of people forget that, particularly in early Pennsylvania, because they weren't building a church when they went out into the middle of, what was then nowhere. But the Methodist minister rode on horseback and visited them and would have maybe conducted a service in a large building or something, but there weren't records of that. I mean, there are some journals of Methodist ministers, and they talked about who they visited and things like that, and arguing with the Calvinists, which I assume was a Presbyterian minister, about the fate of the human soul and, things like that. It's great reading, but in terms of genealogy, it's very frustrating because you're not sure, how old was this woman when she died? He just mentions that somebody dies, you're like, okay. But
Well, and
anyway,
religion
yeah,
on the ground in America, Denise, is another important point to remember, and it's
yeah.
that you, particularly places like Southwest, or like Georgia, Southwest Georgia, you don't have a trained Presbyterian clergy or Catholic priest, so a lot of people from a Catholic Presbyterian background end up as Baptist, Southern Baptist congregations. So simply because there are no ministers or priests there to administer to the flock, and so they just go to a church that is there. So, and also pointed, both my colleagues alluded to already, back in Ireland, some people totally indifferent, they're not religious at all, and they'll just, like go any direction in the stream, so not particularly worried about it. So if they marry somebody who's very devout, they'll go in that direction.
Was there anything else that I should have asked about or that you wanted to mention? I know I'm very excited to get back into my Irish research. I've got lots of time. A lot of us have lots of time here, and I have lots of studying to do between names and geography and places, to really understand it. And this is the time to do it. But what else did you want to share with the audience?
Denise has alluded to already to early settlers in Pennsylvania. So did you just want to maybe touch on migration and again the misconception about 18th century?
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose there is a broader misconception that, for example, the Scots-Irish Presbyterians emigrated to America in the 18th century, and then the Catholic Irish emigrated in the 19th century. But it is a much more complex picture than that. Certainly, through the most of the 18th century, the majority of immigrants from Ireland do seem to have been Ulster Presbyterians. But a proportion of immigrants were Catholics, and a proportion were other Protestant religions. In the 19th century, you still have significant numbers of Protestant Irish immigrating to North America. Obviously, you do have large numbers of Catholic Irish as well, but it's not like a neat, clear-cut division that, say, colonial America, it's Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and then 19th century, especially from the famine period onward, it's the Catholic Irish. It is a much more complex picture than that.
I was just going to say, you'd mentioned about the virtual course. So we're running another one. Is it? And you get access for, is it 4 weeks or 5 weeks maybe? So you have time to work through all the talks. And then there's Q&As with myself and William and Fintan as well. So yeah, that's something, if you want to delve into this now as people have more time over these next few months, that's definitely something worth looking into. The information will be on our website, ancestryireland.com. And for those of you, I think, who are maybe stuck at a brick wall or don't know how to get started, or have got to a certain stage and don't know how to push forward, we have a range of research services. So they range from like in-depth archival research in the Public Record Office, which has been closed a lot of this year. Hopefully maybe in 2021 we'll be able to get into it a bit more often. And also things like document retrieval. So if you've identified a document and you just need us to go to Prony and take a photo of it or something, we can do that. And also a service called Initial Assessment, and that's something where we assess the information you have and suggest the next best steps in your research. So that's really good. If you want to do the research yourself, you kind of get like a little research plan of this is where to look next. But also if maybe you just want us to carry on with the research, it gives you an idea of what is available, what is achievable, what kind of records we can look at in the archives. So again, those are all on our website, ancestryireland.com, and we'd be delighted, there's so much you can do online, but there's also actually so many records that are just in the archives. So that's either you planning a trip whenever we can take trips again to come over to Ireland yourself and look in the archives, and we run those conferences that you're with us in the archives and we assist you in your research, or you might come on your own research trip. Or, if you just want, if you're not in a position where you can travel to Ireland anytime soon, we can do the research for you and then we can write it up and send you it. So yeah, do have a look. We'd be delighted to help you kind of continue on your family history research into your Irish and Scots-Irish ancestors.
And we reinforced that point Gillian just made, and it also goes back almost to where we started about the loss of records, no point in Irish research, it's all destroyed. There's also, because of the prominence of digitization in the last 15 years, that people think, well, if it isn't online on Ancestry or Family Past, it doesn't exist. And nothing could be further from the truth. And even Ancestry and Find My Path may not be the best starting point for your Irish research. There's all other much better resources, and many of them free, that one could start with. For example, the National Archive and Pony's own websites, and then the Roots Ireland website, which has over 20 billion records. And the value of Roots Ireland, these are birth, marriages and deaths, gravestone inscriptions. So it's not like a census record where it's one snapshot in time. You've got generation after generation of potentially your ancestors on these websites. So people shouldn't assume, all you can find on the major sources will be the limit of what you can do with your Irish research. As Gillian said, if you are able to travel, when we hopefully are traveling again, you'd be able to get an idea of the richness of the material held. And William alluded to it as well. Prony is so well known for its collection of private records, as well as its responsibility as the public record office. It's its private collections that make it stand out for family history research. And a lot of that material, despite the technology, still don't lend themselves too easily to be transcribed, digitized. And so in many instances, and also it's a resource issue, that the record office has not had the resources to digitize them yet. So it is a case of going to the archive yourself or getting somebody to go on your behalf. And while that maybe is a bit frustrating if you're sitting, wherever, it does also, it's the sort of the prize that's up there when we can travel again, that there is more potential, there's more opportunity for pursuing your family history. It's not necessarily at a brick wall that you think it is. But the time that we have now, people should delve into the free, and most of the websites we listed were free resources which they can mine information from while sitting in their own home. But don't forget, don't just think about going to the databases and getting, they come with reams of very valuable information that help explain the background to the source, the historical context of the source. So there's a lot of reading around the subject and the sources that people can do to get a far better understanding of how it works, how it fits together, and hopefully make them better fishers. That's what the foundation does. We teach people how to go fish. And as everybody knows, how to land that big salmon or trout, there's a few techniques involved. And that's where the foundation's research team excel.
Excellent. I think these 5 misconceptions that you gave us too will really get us on the right path, so that when we do get to Ireland, when we contact you, we know, we're confident we've done the right part on our end, or we've done the best that we can with what we know. So I can't thank you all enough. This was wonderful. First, it's wonderful just to see that people are happy and healthy in a different part of the world, because my world myself has shrunk. The number of people I see is my neighbors and, a few people at the store or whatever. I'm sure you're in the same boat. And I can't wait till you can come back over here and spend time with us to share again everything that you have, and we can come visit you.
No, it was lovely speaking with you.
So now that we've wrapped up all these misconceptions and possible mistakes that we made in our research, I'm curious, do you have an ancestor that gave you a particularly hard time as you were researching them, an Irish ancestor? I'd love to hear about it. Drop it in the show notes. Leave me a comment at my website, paancestors.com. I hope you tune in for next week's episode. We're going to continue our tour in our past with our ancestors, and I hope you make lots of great discoveries about your Pennsylvania ancestors between now and when I catch you next week.